She was invited to the ball as a cruel jest until the Duke asked for the first waltz and never let her go. She stood in the center of the ballroom, trembling in a borrowed gown 2 seasons out of fashion, while 300 pairs of eyes watched her like vultures circling carrion. The invitation had been slipped under her door with no name, no seal, just an address and a time. She should have known. Lady Pemberton's cruel laugh echoed from the corner where the matrons gathered, and Arabella Thorne felt the hot sting of tears she refused to shed. They had invited her here to watch her crumble, to see the ruined daughter of a traitor finally break. But then the ballroom doors opened with such force that the chandeliers trembled, and the Duke of Ashworth strode through the parted crowd like a dark angel of vengeance, his silver eyes fixed only on her. Wait, before the next confession unfolds. If this story has already stirred your heart, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss the next betrayal, kiss, or redemption, subscribe and join our circle. The next heartbeat might change everything. Now, back to the scene. The Duke moved with the lethal grace of a predator, his black evening clothes immaculate, his jaw set in a line that suggested barely controlled fury. Arabella had never been this close to him before, had only seen him from afar at her father's trial 2 years ago, when he had been among the lords who voted for conviction. Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, was known throughout England as the Ice Duke, a man who had never taken a mistress, never courted, never shown warmth to anyone since returning from the Napoleonic Wars with a scar across his throat and shadows in his eyes. He stopped directly before her, and the entire ballroom held its breath. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice rough as gravel, carrying across the suddenly silent hall, "I believe you promised me the first waltz." It was a lie. They had never spoken. She had promised him nothing. But his hand was extended, and in his silver eyes she saw something that made her heart slam against her ribs. Not cruelty, but a desperate, fierce command. "Trust me." Her hand shook as she placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness, and he led her to the center of the floor as the orchestra, confused but obedient, began the opening strains of a Viennese waltz. "Why?" she whispered, as his hand settled at her waist, sending heat through the thin silk of her gown. "Because they invited you here to destroy you," he murmured, pulling her into the first turn with such confidence that her feet followed without thought. "And I will not permit it." The ballroom blurred around them, all those faces, all that judgment, but his eyes never left hers. Up close, she could see that they weren't cold at all. They were the silver of dawn breaking over ice, and there was something burning beneath. "You voted to hang my father," she said, because she needed him to know she wasn't naive enough to believe in rescue. "I voted according to the evidence presented," he replied, spinning her with perfect precision. "Evidence I have since learned was manufactured." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What?" But he shook his head minutely, his hand tightening at her waist. "Dance with me, Miss Thorne. Let them see that you have not been broken. Let them see that you have an ally they did not anticipate." She didn't understand, couldn't comprehend why the Duke of Ashworth, a man who had never shown mercy to anyone, would suddenly stand as her champion. But as he guided her through the waltz with a skill that made her feel like she was floating, she realized that everyone was watching with very different expressions now. Not mockery, not pity, fear. Because if the Duke had claimed her as his partner, then she was no longer prey. She was under his protection. And no one in this room was foolish enough to cross Alexander Blackwood. The waltz ended, but he didn't release her hand. "You will dance every dance tonight," he said quietly, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a touch that felt absurdly intimate. "And tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock you will come to Ashworth House. We have much to discuss about your father's trial, Miss Thorne, and about the men who orchestrated his downfall." "Why would you help me?" she breathed. Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or old guilt. "Because I have spent 2 years investigating what I helped condemn, and I have discovered that justice was never served. Your father was innocent, Miss Thorne, and the men who destroyed him are still free." Before she could respond, before she could process the magnitude of what he'd just revealed, he bowed over her hand with courtly precision and pressed his lips to her glove, a gesture so archaic and so deliberate that gasps rippled through the crowd. "Until tomorrow," he said. Then he released her and walked from the ballroom with the same commanding presence with which he'd entered, leaving her standing alone in the center of the floor with her heart racing and her entire world tilting on its axis. Lady Pemberton's face had gone white as parchment. Lord Hastings looked ill, and Arabella suddenly understood that this had never been just a cruel jest. This had been a trap. But not for her, for them. The invitation had arrived 3 days earlier, slipped under the door of the tiny rooms above the milliner's shop where Arabella had lived since her father's execution. No seal, no signature, just elegant script on expensive paper inviting her to the Pemberton ball. She should have burned it. Should have known that society would never welcome back the daughter of a convicted traitor. But 2 years of scrubbing floors and sewing until her fingers bled had left her desperate for one evening of beauty, one night to remember what it felt like to be human. So she'd borrowed a gown from Mary, the milliner's daughter, and styled her dark hair in the simple fashion she could manage without a lady's maid. The emerald silk was outdated and slightly too large, but in candlelight she'd thought it might pass. She'd thought wrong. The moment she'd entered the Pemberton ballroom, she'd felt it, the wrongness, the way conversation stopped, the way eyes tracked her with predatory interest. Lady Pemberton's smile had been all teeth and malice. "Why, Miss Thorne," she'd purred, loud enough for everyone to hear. "How delightful that you could join us. I wasn't certain our invitation would reach you in wherever it is you're living now." The laughter had been like knives. Arabella had stood frozen, realizing too late that she'd walked into an ambush. They had invited her here specifically to humiliate her, to watch her stand alone and friendless in a room full of people who blamed her for the sins of a father she'd never stopped loving. And then the Duke had arrived. Now, as she made her way back through the dark streets toward the milliner's shop, her mind raced. The Duke of Ashworth believed her father was innocent, had been investigating. But why? What possible reason could he have for caring about a dead traitor's reputation? She thought of the way he'd looked at her, of the barely restrained fury in his movements as he'd strode across that ballroom, of the gentleness in his touch when he'd taken her hand. "I will not permit it." As if her destruction was something he could prevent with sheer will alone. The shop was dark when she arrived. She climbed the narrow stairs to her rooms, her mind so occupied that she didn't notice the shadow in the corner until it moved. "You went?" Arabella spun, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure stepped forward into the moonlight streaming through the window, a young man with auburn hair and her father's green eyes. "Thomas," she breathed, "my God, you can't be here. If anyone discovers—" "That the traitor's son is still alive?" her brother finished bitterly. He'd been only 16 when their father was arrested, and he'd escaped England by the barest margin, fleeing to France with false papers and a new name. "I heard about the invitation, Bella. I came to warn you. It was a trap." "It was," she agreed, sinking onto the narrow bed. "But something happened. Something I don't understand." She told him about the Duke, about the waltz, about the impossible claim that their father had been innocent. Thomas listened with growing agitation, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "Ashworth," he muttered. "I know that name. He was Wellington's intelligence officer during the war. If he's been investigating Father's trial—" He stopped, turning to face her. "Bella, you can't go to Ashworth House tomorrow." "I have to," she said quietly, "if there's even a chance he's telling the truth." "He's using you," Thomas cut her off. "Don't you see? The Duke needs something, and he's dangling hope in front of you like bait. Our father is dead. His innocence or guilt no longer matters." "It matters to me," Arabella said fiercely. "Every night I lie awake wondering if he truly betrayed England. If the man who taught me to read, who carried me on his shoulders through Hyde Park, who never raised his voice in anger, if that man was capable of selling military secrets to Napoleon, I need to know, Thomas. I need to know the truth." Her brother's expression softened. He sat beside her, taking her cold hands in his. "And if the truth is that he was guilty, could you bear it?" "I already bear it," she whispered. "Every day, every time someone spits at my feet in the street or refuses to serve me in shops, I carry his guilt like a stone around my neck." "If the Duke can prove Father's innocence, then perhaps—" She couldn't finish, couldn't voice the desperate hope that she might finally be free. Thomas was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. "If you go to Ashworth House, you go armed with knowledge. I've spent 2 years in France making connections, Bella, digging into the intelligence networks that were active during the war. And I've learned things about Father's case, things that kept me alive because they were too dangerous to expose." Arabella's breath caught. "What things?" "Father wasn't a traitor," Thomas said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He was a spy master, one of Wellington's most trusted intelligence officers. The information that supposedly incriminated him, the documents found in his study, they were planted. Father was investigating a conspiracy within the highest levels of British government, and he was killed to silence him." Arabella's breath caught. "What things?" "Father wasn't a traitor," Thomas said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He was a spy master, one of Wellington's most trusted intelligence officers. The information that supposedly incriminated him, the documents found in his study, they were planted. Father was investigating a conspiracy within the highest levels of British government, and he was killed to silence him." The room seemed to tilt. Arabella gripped her brother's hands. Then why was he tried? Why didn't Wellington speak in his defense? "Because Wellington didn't know," Thomas said grimly. "The conspiracy went deeper than anyone realized. Someone very close to the Duke of Wellington was feeding information to the French. Father discovered who it was, but before he could report it, he was arrested. The documents were found, and he was executed before he could speak a word in his own defense." "Who?" Arabella demanded. "Who was the traitor?" Thomas met her eyes. "I don't have proof yet, but I have suspicions. And if I'm right, then your Duke of Ashworth is either a remarkably brave man or part of the very conspiracy that killed our father." Arabella did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed watching the shadows on the ceiling, her brother's words echoing in her mind. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would go to Ashworth House. She would listen to what the Duke had to say, and she would judge for herself whether he was savior or serpent. At 9:30, she put on her best day dress, a simple gray muslin that had seen better years, and pinned up her hair with the last decent hairpins she owned. She looked pale and thin in the cracked mirror above her washstand, but her eyes were steady. 2 years of survival had stripped away the soft, sheltered girl she'd been. What remained was harder, stronger. Ashworth House stood in Grosvenor Square, a massive stone edifice that spoke of old wealth and older power. Arabella climbed the front steps with her heart hammering, aware that she was likely walking into another trap. But the memory of the Duke's eyes, that fierce, desperate command, kept her moving forward. The butler who answered her knock showed no surprise at her appearance, merely bowed and murmured, "Miss Thorne, His Grace is expecting you in the library." She followed him through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced Blackwoods, past rooms filled with priceless art and furniture that gleamed with beeswax and care. Everything about Ashworth House spoke of permanence, of a family so rooted in England's history that they were almost part of the landscape itself. The library was a cathedral of books, 2 stories high with a gallery running around the upper level. Morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating thousands of leather-bound volumes. And in the center of it all, standing before a massive desk covered in papers, was the Duke. He'd shed his evening clothes for simpler attire: dark trousers, a white shirt open at the collar, a waistcoat of charcoal gray. Without his coat and cravat, he looked younger, more human. The scar across his throat was more visible, a thin white line that suggested someone had once tried very hard to kill him. He turned as she entered, and something in his expression shifted. Surprise, perhaps, or relief. "Miss Thorne," he said, his rough voice gentler than she remembered. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would." "I wasn't certain I should," she replied honestly. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "Your caution is wise. Please, sit." He gestured to a chair near the fire. "Would you care for tea?" "I'd care for answers," she said, remaining standing. "Last night you claimed my father was innocent, that the evidence against him was manufactured. I need to know how you came to that conclusion, Your Grace, and why you would suddenly champion the daughter of a man you helped condemn." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and she had the distinct impression he was weighing how much truth she could bear. Finally, he moved to the desk and picked up a leather-bound folio. "What do you know about your father's work during the war, Miss Thorne?" "He was an attaché to the War Office," she said, repeating what she'd been told. "He managed correspondence and—" "He was one of Wellington's most valuable intelligence officers," the Duke interrupted quietly. "He ran a network of agents across France, feeding us information that saved thousands of British lives. Your father was a brilliant strategist and a brave man. He was also my friend." The last words were spoken with such raw pain that Arabella's defenses cracked. She sank into the offered chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "Then why didn't you speak for him at the trial?" she whispered. "Because I didn't," the Duke said, and she heard the self-loathing in his voice. "I was in Belgium when your father was arrested. By the time I returned to England, the trial was over, and the evidence seemed irrefutable. Documents in your father's own hand, detailing troop movements and military strategies. A coded letter to a known French agent. Testimony from his own clerk that he'd seen your father encrypt the messages." He opened the folio and began laying out papers on the desk between them. "I voted for conviction because I believed the evidence. And for 2 years, that vote has haunted me. Because I knew Thomas Thorne. I had worked beside him, trusted him with my life, and something about his supposed betrayal never sat right." Arabella rose and approached the desk, studying the documents. They looked official: court records, transcripts, evidence logs. But the Duke was pointing to something else, a separate stack of papers covered in his own dark scrawl. 6 months ago, I began investigating in earnest, he said. I tracked down your father's clerk, the man who testified against him. I found him in Dover, dying of consumption and drowning in guilt. Before he died, he confessed that he'd been paid to lie. Paid to claim he'd seen your father encrypt messages that were actually planted in his study. Arabella's hand flew to her mouth. Paid by whom? He didn't know names, the Duke said grimly, only that the money came from someone high in government, someone with enough power to orchestrate a treason trial and ensure the outcome. He pulled out another document, a letter yellowed with age. This was among your father's effects, seized after his arrest. It's addressed to me, but I never received it. It was misplaced in the evidence room. I found it only 2 months ago. With trembling hands, Arabella took the letter. Her father's handwriting, bold and precise, leaped off the page. Alexander, if you are reading this, then I am likely dead or arrested. I have discovered something that will shake the foundations of the War Office. Someone very close to Wellington is feeding intelligence to the French, someone with access to the highest levels of military planning. I have narrowed it down to 3 possibilities, but I need more time to determine which. I have hidden my evidence in a place only you would think to look. Trust no one else. The conspiracy goes deeper than we imagined. If I fall, protect my children. They are innocent of any wrongdoing, and they will pay for my investigation if given the chance. Your friend, Thomas. Arabella read the letter 3 times, tears blurring her vision. Her father had known he was in danger, had tried to warn the Duke, and the Duke had never received the warning. Someone intercepted this letter, she said, her voice shaking. Someone who knew your father was investigating them. Yes, the Duke confirmed. And that same someone orchestrated his arrest, planted the evidence, and ensured he was executed before he could speak in his own defense. Then we have to find them, Arabella said fiercely, looking up at him. We have to expose them and clear my father's name. The Duke's expression was grave. Miss Thorne, the men capable of orchestrating something like this, they are powerful beyond measure. Attempting to expose them could get us both killed. I don't care, she said flatly. My father's name has been dragged through mud for 2 years. My family has been destroyed. My brother lives in exile. I will not let his murderers walk free simply because they are powerful. Something ignited in the Duke's silver eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred fury. He nodded slowly. Then we are allies, he said. But you must understand what you're agreeing to, Miss Thorne. These men will stop at nothing to protect their secret. They have already killed once. They will kill again. Then we must be smarter than they are, Arabella said. You mentioned evidence. My father said he hid it somewhere only you would think to look. Do you know where? The Duke hesitated, then turned toward the shelves that lined the walls. Your father and I served together in Spain before Waterloo. We were pinned down behind enemy lines for 3 days with no supplies and no hope of rescue. To pass the time, we played a game, hiding messages for each other in books, seeing who could find them first. He ran his hand along a shelf, then pulled down a worn copy of Paradise Lost. Your father loved Milton. Said that understanding the fall of angels helped him understand the fall of men. He opened the book to a specific page, and a folded paper fell out. Arabella's breath caught. The Duke unfolded it carefully, revealing a list of names, dates, and transactions. At the top, in her father's hand, were the words, "Follow the money." These are payments, the Duke said, his voice tight with controlled rage. Significant sums, all funneled through a series of banks and shell companies. Your father was tracing them back to their source. Arabella scanned the list, her heart sinking as she recognized several prominent names. Lords, generals, men of immense power and influence. And at the bottom of the page, circled 3 times, was a single name that made her blood run cold. "Lord Hastings," she whispered. The Duke's jaw clenched. Wellington's chief military secretary, a man with access to every battle plan, every troop movement, every strategic decision made during the war. "He was at the ball last night," Arabella said, remembering the way Lord Hastings had looked when the Duke claimed her for the waltz. "Not angry, afraid. He looked ill when he saw us together. Because he knows that if I'm investigating your father's case, I will eventually find the truth, and when I do, he will hang." "Then we have to move quickly," Arabella said, "before he realizes we have this evidence and moves to destroy it. Or us." The Duke looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part admiration, part concern. "You are your father's daughter," he said quietly, "brave and reckless in equal measure." "Reckless would be doing nothing," she countered. "What do we do next?" The Duke set the paper down and faced her fully. "We need proof of the payments, bank records, correspondence, something that directly ties Hastings to the French agents. Your father's notes give us a starting point, but they're not enough to convict a man of his position." "Then we find the proof," Arabella said simply. "It won't be easy," the Duke warned. "Hastings is careful. He's maintained his position and reputation through 2 years of peace. If there's evidence, it will be hidden in the most secure of places." "Then we'll have to be cleverer," Arabella said. A thought occurred to her. "Your Grace, do you attend meetings at the War Office?" "Frequently," he confirmed. "As a peer with military experience, I'm often consulted on policy matters." "Then you have access to Hastings' office." The Duke's eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting I search the office of the Chief Military Secretary? That's beyond reckless, Miss Thorne. That's potentially treasonous." "Is it treason to seek evidence of actual treason?" she challenged. He didn't answer immediately, but she could see the calculation in his eyes. Finally, he shook his head, not in denial, but in resignation. "You are dangerous, Miss Thorne. Absolutely dangerous. My father raised me to think, not merely to ornament drawing rooms," she said. "Will you do it?" "I will consider it," he said carefully. "But there may be a better way. Hastings is hosting a gathering at his estate next week, a celebration of the anniversary of Waterloo. As a war hero, I'm expected to attend, and I believe the social conventions would permit me to bring a guest." Understanding dawned. "You want me to search his house while everyone is occupied with the celebration?" "I want you to remain safe in London," the Duke corrected. "But I suspect you would simply attempt something foolhardy on your own if I excluded you from the planning." She couldn't help but smile. "You're learning, Your Grace." "Alexander," he said suddenly, "if we're to be conspirators together, Miss Thorne, you should call me Alexander, at least in private." The intimacy of it struck her unexpectedly. This powerful Duke, this cold, unreachable man whom society feared, he was asking her to use his given name. "Then, you must call me Arabella," she said softly. He nodded, and for just a moment something warm flickered in his silver eyes. "Arabella," he repeated, as if testing how her name felt on his tongue. "We have 1 week to prepare, 1 week to plan how to infiltrate Hastings' estate and find the evidence we need. Are you truly prepared for this?" She thought of her father's face the last time she'd seen him, in the courtroom, looking at her with such love and such sorrow. She thought of Thomas, living in exile, unable to come home. She thought of 2 years of poverty and shame and endless, grinding survival. "I am prepared," she said firmly, "for whatever it takes." Alexander studied her for a long moment, and she had the sense that he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a victim to be pitied or a pawn to be used, but as an equal, a partner. "Then God help Lord Hastings," he said quietly, "because we will not stop until justice is served." The week that followed was the strangest of Arabella's life. Each morning she would make her way to Ashworth House through the servants' entrance, and she and Alexander would spend hours in the library planning their approach. He taught her about military intelligence, about reading financial documents, about the subtle signs of deception. She shared what Thomas had learned in France, the connections her brother had made in Napoleon's former network. They worked well together, she discovered. Alexander's mind was precise and strategic, but he listened when she offered alternative perspectives. And despite his fearsome reputation, he was surprisingly patient with her, explaining complex intelligence matters without condescension. But it wasn't just the work that occupied her thoughts. It was the way Alexander would absently run his hand through his dark hair when he was thinking, the way his voice would soften when he spoke about her father. The way he looked at her sometimes, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. On the third day, as they were reviewing maps of Hastings' estate, Alexander suddenly asked, "Why did you accept my hand that night? At the ball?" Arabella looked up from the papers, startled. I don't know. There was something in your eyes, a command, as if you were ordering me to trust you." "I was," he admitted. "I saw you standing there, realized what they'd done, and He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "I have witnessed many cruelties, Arabella. War strips away pretense and reveals what people truly are. But the deliberate humiliation of an innocent woman for sport, that particular brand of cruelty still has the power to enrage me." "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you care? You didn't know me." Alexander was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, very quietly, he said, "I had a sister, Elizabeth. She was only 17 when she fell in love with a young officer, a good man, honorable, but without fortune or title. My father forbade the match. Elizabeth defied him, and he invited her to what she thought was a reconciliation dinner. Instead, he publicly disowned her in front of 100 guests. The humiliation broke something in her. She died 3 months later of a fever. She stopped fighting." Arabella's hand found his without conscious thought. "Alexander, I'm so sorry." "I was at war when it happened," he continued, his voice rough with old grief. "I came home to find her buried and my father unrepentant. He said she'd brought shame on the family, that her death was her own fault for being foolish enough to love unwisely." His fingers tightened around hers. "When I saw you in that ballroom, I saw Elizabeth, and I swore that I would not stand by and watch another innocent woman be destroyed by the casual cruelty of our class." "Is that why you've never married?" Arabella asked gently. "Never courted?" He met her eyes, and the pain in them made her chest ache. "I swore after Elizabeth died that I would never subject a woman to the expectations and restrictions of being a duchess, that I would never risk creating more suffering simply because society demanded an heir and a hostess." "That's a lonely oath," Arabella said. "Loneliness is preferable to causing harm," Alexander replied. But his thumb was tracing small circles on her palm, and she wondered if he truly believed that anymore. They didn't speak of it again, but something had shifted between them. A new understanding, fragile and profound. On the 6th day, as they were finalizing their plans for infiltrating Hastings' gathering, Thomas appeared at Ashworth House. Arabella had told Alexander about her brother's return to England, and the Duke had promised to help secure Thomas' safety once the conspiracy was exposed. Thomas studied Alexander with open suspicion as they met in the library. "So you're the Ice Duke," he said flatly. "And you're the supposedly dead traitor's son," Alexander replied evenly. "We all carry dramatic titles, it seems." Despite herself, Arabella smiled at the dry humor. Thomas's expression cracked slightly. "My sister says I can trust you," Thomas said. "I'm not certain I agree, but she's rarely wrong about people." "Then I hope to prove her right," Alexander said. He gestured to the maps spread across the desk. "Your intelligence from France has been invaluable. I was hoping you might be willing to provide more direct assistance." Thomas crossed his arms. "What kind of assistance?" "Hastings is expecting me at his gathering, but not alone," Alexander said. "I need someone who can move through his household staff unnoticed, someone who can ask questions and observe without raising suspicion." "You want me to pose as a servant?" "I want you to use skills you developed staying alive in France," Alexander corrected. "Bella will be with me as my guest, providing cover and distraction. But we need someone who can search the private areas of the house, the places where damning evidence is more likely to be hidden." Thomas looked at Arabella. "You're going into the lion's den." "With a lion of my own," she replied, glancing at Alexander. Something complicated passed over Thomas's face. "You trust him?" It wasn't a question, but Arabella answered anyway. "I do." Thomas studied Alexander for another long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, I'll help. But if anything happens to my sister, Your Grace, I will find you, and I will not be merciful." "I would expect nothing less," Alexander said seriously. "She is precious. I will guard her with my life." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. Arabella felt heat rise in her cheeks, and when she dared look at Alexander, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Thomas cleared his throat. "Right. So, the plan." They spent the rest of the evening coordinating their approach. Thomas would arrive separately, using false papers that identified him as a wine merchant delivering rare vintages for the celebration. Once inside, he would slip away from the legitimate servants and begin his search. Arabella and Alexander would attend the gathering openly, using their presence to keep Hastings and his closest associates. "The study is our primary target," Alexander said, marking the location on the map. "Hastings is paranoid about security. If there's evidence, it will be locked away there." "Can you pick locks?" Thomas asked Arabella. She thought of 2 years of breaking into locked storage rooms to steal food, of teaching herself to manipulate the cheap locks on the milliner's shop. "Yes," she said simply. Both men looked at her with surprise. Alexander's lips quirked. "You are full of unexpected talents, Miss Thorne." "Survival teaches many skills," she replied. The night before the gathering, Alexander asked her to stay after Thomas left. They stood in the library, the fire burning low, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Tomorrow will be dangerous," he said quietly. "If Hastings suspects what we're doing." "Then we'll face whatever comes," Arabella interrupted. "Together." "Together," he echoed. Then, very carefully, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, and she found herself leaning into the touch. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice dropping lower. "What began as a quest for justice has become something else for me. Somewhere in the past week, Arabella, you have become important. Not just as Thomas's daughter, not just as a victim of injustice, but as yourself, as a woman of courage and intelligence and fierce loyalty." Her heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. "Alexander!" "I know the impropriety of saying such things," he continued. "I know that I am supposed to maintain distance, to be the cold duke who feels nothing. But I find that I cannot maintain that fiction with you. I find that when you walk into a room, the air feels different. That when you smile, something in my chest loosens. That the thought of you in danger makes me want to burn the world down to keep you safe." "That sounds very inconvenient," Arabella managed, her voice shaking. "Devastatingly so," he agreed. A slight smile touched his mouth. "I thought you should know. Before tomorrow. In case." He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood. In case something went wrong. In case they didn't both survive. She reached up and laid her palm against his scarred throat, feeling his pulse jump beneath her fingers. "When this is over," she said softly, "when we've exposed Hastings and cleared my father's name, ask me again. Tell me again how you feel. And I will tell you that somewhere in the past week, you've become important to me too. That I think about you constantly. That I trust you with more than my safety. I trust you with the truth of who I am." His hand covered hers, holding it against his throat. "When this is over," he promised. They stood like that for a long moment, neither willing to step away first. Finally, reluctantly, Alexander released her hand. "Go home," he said gently. "Rest. Tomorrow we face the serpent in his den." As Arabella walked back through the dark streets, she realized that everything had changed. This was no longer just about justice or revenge or clearing her father's name. This was about building something new from the ashes of the old, something that felt terrifyingly fragile and impossibly precious. Love, perhaps, or the beginning of it. Hastings Hall stood on the Kent coast, a sprawling estate with views of the Channel. Carriages lined the drive as guests arrived for the Waterloo celebration, the cream of London society dressed in their finest. Arabella sat beside Alexander in his carriage, wearing a gown he'd purchased for her, deep blue silk with silver embroidery, elegant without being ostentatious. She looked like she belonged among the nobility, which was precisely the point. "Ready?" Alexander asked as they pulled up to the entrance. "No," she admitted, "but I'll do it anyway." His hand found hers, squeezed gently. Courage. They entered together, Alexander's hand at the small of her back in a possessive gesture that made several eyebrows rise. Lord Hastings greeted them at the door, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Ashworth," he said jovially, "delighted you could attend. And Miss Thorne." His gaze raked over her. "Miss Thorne has been kind enough to accept my escort," Alexander said smoothly. "I hope that's not a problem, Hastings." "Of course not," Hastings replied, though his jaw was tight. "Any guest of yours is welcome." They moved through the gathering, accepting champagne, making polite conversation. Arabella caught sight of Lady Pemberton and felt a surge of vindictive satisfaction at the woman's shocked expression. She was no longer the humiliated girl in borrowed clothes. Tonight, escorted by the most powerful duke in England, she was untouchable. But beneath the social niceties, she was counting doors, noting hallways, memorizing the layout exactly as Alexander had drawn it from his memory of previous visits. The study was on the second floor, 3 doors down from the main staircase. Thomas would be inside by now, masquerading as part of the service staff. The plan was for Arabella to create a distraction, something that would pull Hastings and his closest associates away from the house long enough for her to search the study. The opportunity came sooner than expected. As they stood on the terrace overlooking the channel, Alexander engaged Hastings in conversation about military tactics, drawing him into a debate that attracted other veterans. Arabella excused herself, claiming she needed to freshen up, and slipped back inside. The house was quieter away from the gathering, the hallways lit by candlelight. She moved quickly, her heart racing. The study door was locked, but she'd come prepared. 2 hairpins and the skill born of necessity. It took less than a minute to manipulate the lock. Inside, the study was all dark wood and leather, dominated by a massive desk. Arabella closed the door behind her and began searching systematically. Drawers, shelves, the panels behind portraits. Nothing. She was beginning to despair when her fingers found it. A slight depression in the wood paneling beside the fireplace. She pressed, and a hidden compartment opened. Inside was a leather ledger and a stack of correspondence. Arabella's hands shook as she opened the ledger. Pages and pages of transactions, amounts, dates, everything her father had been tracing. And beneath it, letters written in French, signed with Hastings' distinctive flourish. Evidence. Undeniable proof that Lord Hastings had been selling military intelligence to the French for years. "Well," a cold voice said from behind her, "this is unfortunate." Arabella spun around. Lord Hastings stood in the doorway, blocking her exit, a pistol in his hand. "I had hoped it wouldn't come to this," Hastings said, his jovial mask completely gone. "When I saw Ashworth pursuing you, I knew he'd been digging into your father's case, but I thought I had more time." "The Duke knows everything," Arabella lied desperately. "If you harm me—" "If I harm you, it will be unfortunate, but explicable. A thief caught in the act, shot while attempting to flee. Tragic, really. The daughter of a traitor following in her father's footsteps." He raised the pistol, and Arabella's mind raced. She was trapped. The ledger was in her hands, but it would do no good if she was dead. "Lord Hastings," a new voice cut through the tension. Thomas stepped out of the shadows behind Hastings, a pistol of his own pressed against the Lord's temple. "I suggest you lower your weapon, slowly." Hastings froze. "Who the devil?" "Thomas Thorne," her brother said coldly. "The other child of the traitor you murdered. And unlike my sister, I have spent 2 years learning all the ways to kill a man and make it look like an accident. So, please, give me a reason." The standoff held for one breathless moment. Then footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Alexander appeared, his own pistol drawn. "Lord Hastings," he said, his voice like winter, "I believe this would be an excellent time to surrender." Hastings looked between them, and Arabella saw the moment he realized it was over. His shoulders sagged. Thomas took his pistol, and Alexander pulled the bell cord, summoning his own men, guards he'd strategically positioned around the estate. "Your Grace," Hastings said, attempting dignity even now, "surely we can come to some arrangement." "The only arrangement you'll be making is with the hangman," Alexander cut him off. "You sold out your country. You murdered an innocent man to cover your crimes. And you nearly killed the woman I—" He stopped himself, but Arabella heard what he hadn't said. Hastings laughed bitterly. "The woman you what, Ashworth? Love? How touching, how utterly pointless. Even if you expose me, do you think it will end here? I'm not the only one. The conspiracy goes higher than you imagine." "Then we'll find them too," Alexander said flatly. "Every last one." The guards arrived and took Hastings into custody. As they led him away, still protesting, Arabella finally allowed herself to breathe. The ledger was still in her hands, proof of everything her father had died to expose. Thomas pulled her into a fierce hug. "Don't ever do that again," he muttered. "My heart can't take it." "Agreed," Alexander said, and there was something raw in his voice that made her look up at him. His face was pale, his silver eyes blazing. "When I saw him with that pistol—" She handed the ledger to Thomas, then went to Alexander. "I'm safe," she said softly. We're all safe, and we have the evidence." He pulled her against him, his arms coming around her with a desperation that spoke more than words. "I thought I might lose you," he said into her hair, "before I ever had the chance to. He drew back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. "To tell you that I love you. That somewhere between that waltz and now, you became the most important thing in my world. That if you'll have me, if you can forgive the fact that I voted to condemn your father before I knew the truth, I would very much like to spend the rest of my life proving that I can be worthy of you." Around them, Thomas was making pointed coughing sounds, but Arabella couldn't look away from Alexander's eyes. "I love you too," she said, and watched wonder bloom across his face. "And there's nothing to forgive. You sought the truth. You've given my father back his honor. You've given me back my name. How could I not love you?" He kissed her then, there in the hallway of Hastings Hall, with stolen evidence and captured traitors and all the chaos of justice being served. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce and desperate and full of the fear of losing something precious. When they finally broke apart, Thomas was grinning. "If you two are quite finished, we should probably leave before more conspirators show up." "Practical as ever," Alexander said dryly, but he didn't release Arabella. They left Hastings Hall together, a duke, a supposedly dead son, and a woman who'd been invited to a ball as a jest and ended up bringing down a conspiracy. Behind them, the evidence that would clear Thomas Thorne's name and expose the rot at the heart of England's military establishment. It took 3 months for the trials to conclude. Lord Hastings was hanged for treason, along with 2 other lords who'd been part of the conspiracy. Thomas Thorne was officially declared innocent, his name restored, his property returned to his heirs. Thomas himself received a formal pardon and a position in the new intelligence office being created to prevent future traitors. And Arabella Thorne became Arabella Blackwood, Duchess of Ashworth, in a wedding that scandalized society and delighted everyone else. They were married in the chapel at Ashworth House, with Thomas giving her away and Mary from the milliner's shop as her only attendant. Arabella wore silver silk and carried white roses, and when Alexander took her hand, she saw everything she needed in his eyes. "I love you," he said as they stood before the altar, "my brave, fierce, remarkable Duchess." "I love you," she replied, "my ice duke who turned out to have the warmest heart." The vicar cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should proceed with the actual ceremony?" They laughed, and it felt like the beginning of something beautiful. Epilogue. 1 year later, Arabella stood in the library at Ashworth House, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly, watching as Alexander and Thomas pored over maps. They were planning a new intelligence network, one built on honor and truth rather than paranoia and betrayal. "Your father would be proud," Alexander said, looking up at her with that soft expression he reserved only for her. "He'd be proud of you, too," Arabella replied, moving to his side. "You gave him justice. You gave us peace." Thomas rolled up the maps. "I should go. Leave you two to your domestic bliss." He hugged his sister, then shook Alexander's hand. "Take care of her, Ashworth." "With my life," Alexander promised. After Thomas left, Alexander pulled Arabella into his arms, his hand covering hers on her belly. "How are you feeling?" "Happy," she said simply, "so incredibly happy." "Even though society still whispers about the duke who married a traitor's daughter?" "Especially because of that," she replied, "because you chose love over reputation, truth over convenience, me over everything." "It was never a choice," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "From the moment I saw you in that ballroom, you were already mine. I just had to prove I was worthy of being yours." She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd saved her with a waltz and won her with his courage. You've proved it every day since. Outside, London carried on. Society gossiped and schemed and played its endless games. But here, in the library of Ashworth House, with her hand in Alexander and their child growing beneath her heart, Arabella Blackwood knew she had everything that mattered: love, truth, family, peace. They had been invited to the ball as a jest. But they had waltzed away with justice and built a life of honor from the ashes of cruelty. And they would never let go. The end. The end.